Hello and welcome to Spirit Plant Medicine. My name is Marc, Caron, one of the co-organizers of the annual Spirit Plant Medicine Conference here in Vancouver, and now streaming literally around the world, so it's very accessible. But I'm really excited today of our panel where we're doing these pre-conference conversations with some of the leading experts around the world in their field. And today we are really excited about our panel. We have a great question that we're asking everybody. And really the question is, what is the role of plant medicines and psychedelics at this time of rapid change and uncertainty in the world today? And I am here with my co-host and good friend, Mr. Stephen Gray. Stephen has been traveling the spiritual and medicine pathways for 50 years. He's a writer, educator, conference organizer, speaker, and cannabis ceremony leader. Stephen is the author and editor of 3 books, including the popular Cannabis and Spirituality, An Explorer's Guide to an Ancient Plant Spirit Ally, and the recently released How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World, Visionary and Indigenous Voices Speak Out. For the past 12 years, Stephen has been the co-director of the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver. Great to see you, Stephen. I'm going to introduce the rest of our guests, and we'll get started with the program. We have the world-renowned mycologist, Mr. Paul Stamets. We're honored to have him with us today. He's the author of 7 books. He's an invention ambassador for the American Association of the Advancement of Science and inducted into the Explorers Club in 2020. He's received numerous awards, including the National Mycologist Award in 2013 from the North American Mycological Association and the Gordon and Tina Wasson Award from the Mycological Society of America. He's named 4 new species of psilocybin mushrooms, and in 2023, he received the Disruptor Award from NextMed. And a new species of psilocybin mushrooms has recently been named after him, the psilocybe Stamets. Hopefully I said that right, but Paul, you can correct me as we move along. We also have Acacea Lewis. Acacea Lewis is the founder of Divine Master Alchemy and the Divine Master University, a school of entheogenic cultural literacy and applied naturopathic medicine research. Acacea is a student of Baba Kalindi Ai, which I had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with a number of years ago before he passed, and teachers from other systems, as well as an independent researcher and lifetime student of the psilocybin mushroom. We also have today William. I believe most of us go by Bill as we had our pre-check today. William Barnard is a professor of religious studies as well as a university distinguished teaching professor at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. His primary areas of research interests are the comparative philosophy of mysticism, religion, and the social sciences, contemporary spirituality, religion, and healing and consciousness studies. And for the past 15 years, Professor Barnard has researched the Santo Daime tradition, a synergistic, entheogenically based new religious movement that emerged in Brazil in the mid-20th century. We also have Ismail Laredo Ali, who has been personally utilizing psychedelics and other substances in celebratory and spiritual contexts for over 15 years and has been actively participating in the drug policy reform movement for a decade. Ismail is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, which most of us know as MAPS, because that is a mouthful. And he serves on the board of directors for the Alchemy Community Therapy Center in the California area. So welcome to the program, everyone. It's really a pleasure to have you all here. And, I bring in my co-host and co-organizer, Mr. Stephen Gray, who's going to kind of lead the way in the questions, and then we'll have a roundtable dialogue in sorts when we hear what the answer to the question is. So, Stephen, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And good job chewing your way through all those multisyllabic words. So just really briefly for our viewers and listeners, the format is going to be 3 parts. We will ask one question to each of the participants in turn, and then the second section will be an open field discussion, and the third, shorter section will be a chance for each of them again in turn to sum up. So we're going to get right into it, and Mark, you're going to call upon the speakers in order because I don't know that order. So I'm going to repeat the question again, and I want to stress that it's meant to be open-ended, that each of these panelists have a wealth of knowledge, insight, and expertise that they can pretty much take anywhere within the overarching view of the role of psychedelics for a planet, you might say, in transition or in crisis. I recently heard the term polycrisis, and I know that sounds a little bit dark to some people. It might be hard for people to wrap their minds around the fact that the rules of the game of life have changed dramatically recently, but that's what we're doing here. We're trying to help people understand how we can participate in our own healing in a way that helps with the healing of others and the planet altogether. So again, the question is, in your way of understanding knowledge and expertise, how do you see the role, the best use and best role of psychedelics at this time in our culture and going forward, of course? Mark?
All right, we're going to call on Mr. Paul Stamets first. Paul, great to see you again, and thank you for taking the time out of your day today to join us.
Well, thank you all for having me. I want to first acknowledge I'm on the ancestral unceded territories of the Caluce people in a remote island in British Columbia. And even though the title of this is plant medicine, mushrooms are not plants, so it should be psychedelics, plants and mushrooms, just to get a little equal weight here between the kingdoms. So my life has been dedicated to the subject. And I'm 68 years of age. I still feel like I'm 32. I have been very much informed by my psilocybin mushroom experiences. I think we're at a time critical in the evolution of the human species where we need to have a paradigm shift in consciousness. And I think psilocybin, from my perspective, is the medicine that is most profound for me seeing into the future. And I think psilocybin is uniquely different than many plants and psychedelics in that it bridges cultures, continents over centuries. There's more than 142 species that are currently identified, with more species being discovered each year. The fact they're circumpolar and they have been used for thousands of years speak to first peoples, indigenous peoples all over the world, exploring their ecosystems. Many people may not realize in the tropical areas of the world, psilocybe cubensis is very easy to locate to find. It's a very large mushroom. In the temperate regions of the world, not so. They're very rare, very hard to find. Only since the advent of cattle and sheep coming from Europe to North America and the practice of creating wood chips for landscaping. It may be that the reservoir for these psilocybin mushrooms were associated with beavers, since they make chips. They have ponds, and there's a lot of water there, etc. But that's just a hypothesis. What is interesting is that as rare as psilocybin mushrooms are in temperate regions, are as common that they are in tropical regions. So there's no doubt we all came from Africa. I think that no one really can seriously argue that we did not. And with human migration, we colonized Europe. Migration and colonization from a biological perspective is the way of passage of humans and animals migrating from one ecosystem to another. So from the migration of humans colonizing Europe, then humans spread throughout the world. So this is why my indigenous friends here in British Columbia like the term first peoples to arrive in an ecosystem and then shepherding that and holding it sacred. And through migration patterns, you meet other individuals on the trail of life and their friend or foe. Far better to be a friend than to be an enemy. I mean, obviously it's very dangerous. If you end up meeting a stranger and you get into an altercation, you get wounded, especially back in the day when we didn't have antibiotics or could treat infections. But the generosity of extension of knowledge and tools and wisdom creates a friendship that's reciprocal. And then in many cultures, the exchange of gifts establishes a relationship of generosity and kindness and cooperation. And that's where I think we are here today at a critical point. I think psilocybin builds bridges. And I think psilocybin makes nicer people. And I think psilocybin makes smarter people. And the research that's coming out on neurogenesis, not only with psilocybin, but with some of these other psychedelics, really points to something fundamental in being able to improve the neurological health of our species. We need people to be more generous, kind, and an extension of generosity, because this is how we build relationships. Right now, we need to come together as one people, more so than ever before. It is our diversity, our biodiversity, our diversity of ethnicities that give us strength, because each one of us, coming from our life experiences or from our cultural backgrounds, bring with us potential solutions, understandings, insights, the ability to help one another. When you help somebody, and I believe evolution is not the survival of the fittest. I believe it's the extension of generosity of the surplus beyond your own needs to others. And when you do that, it's just human nature for them to want to reciprocate. Because when you are in a time of need, they will remember the fact that you were there to help them. So I think we've come to a point in time that psychedelics, and in particular psilocybin, brings people together in a network of individuals and communities where we're all nodes of crossing on a giant network. And the diversity of our ethnicities, the diversity of our cultural heritage, the diversity of the species and substances that we use creates a unified field of consciousness that all of us can participate in and help each other. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. That was great.
Beautifully said, Paul. Yeah, fantastic. So we're going to call on Acacea Lewis next. Acacea, I'm looking forward to what you have to share. I've heard great things about your work.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be featured here amongst other greats like Paul Stamets and yourself, and even our friend William Bill. We share an alma mater, SMU, Southern Methodist University. where I studied astrophysics and geophysics alongside Dr. Robert Kehoe for a short period of 4 years while I was there. Now, something I will say is to answer the question, we need to recognize the pivotal opportunity that we have as a human species at this time. If you've watched the UN Global Summit, the president of Colombia got on stage, and I'm paraphrasing here when I say this, but he said that the 2070 goals that the UN has will not be able to be met due to climate issues, that there is a migration already taking place, and that our country in the United States and many other countries have imprisoned those who are attempting to migrate from places where there is lack of water, where there is pollution, and where the land of beauty is now becoming a land of increasing turmoil and instability in Colombia. And I think this is a red flag that I will highlight in my lecture, how mushrooms can help humans evolve. Is not so much that me being the student of Elder Baba Kalindi E, who was and is Grandmaster Martial Artist title holder and world traveler who worked with many different African species of psilocybin mushroom in indigenous settings where First People still hold the knowledge sacred and is not able to be researched in laboratory environments where you must initiate into secret societies in order to access psilocybin and the rituals and implements that go along with the utilization of psilocybin mushrooms for martial arts, as well as ethical, moral, and cultural artistic expression. As a student of Baba Kalindi's, as a student of Lama Mike Crowley, author of Secret Drugs of Buddhism, and as a traditional Lakota singer, I have utilized the psilocybin mushroom to realign my goals as a human being with the goals of this collective field of consciousness that Paul was highlighting. And these traditions that are paired with the psilocybin mushroom have been around before they had names, before we reverence them as religions or cultural expectations of ritual or ceremonial use. This was a human connection, a human fungi symbiosis, or an organic intelligence, as Grandmaster Kalindi E pointed out to me many times. OI. And, you know, a lot of times people look at the emerging AI and they look at the emerging issues in the world, and we look at ways the AI can solve these issues. And that's very important and a very sacred task for people who are programming AI computers to find solutions to big world problems like pollution and mental instability and depression, which is now becoming a world problem, as well as, you know, depression and anxiety can leave you open to things, viruses like COVID-19. And so I would say that there's a pandemic going on in the human psyche so much as there is a pandemic going on inside of the world as far as viruses are concerned, novel viruses. But when we look back in history, we have to recognize that the last human migration was partially made possible by First Nations people who had an agreement to see each other as brother and sister of this planet and stewards of the planet. And this idea is now becoming more popularized in 2023. However, due to the war on drugs, there is this idea that people who want those goals are hippies or somehow incapable of being responsible in the reverence of cultivating and protecting sacred plants and fungi. And I believe that the longer we spend time feeding this idea that humans who work with psilocybin are irresponsible, and the humans who work with other plant medicines are doing so irresponsibly, we create a vacuum. Whereas we should be providing education to individuals about the existing cultures that claim these sacraments as a sacred tool or technology, from Africa to Tibet, to India, to Australia, to Mexico, to Peru, There are so many cultures, and the mushroom is so old in respect to the human physical form, going back maybe 20 million years, 200 million years, potentially, or even longer ago. The psilocybin mushroom was here on this planet. And so we need to take into consideration that it was here in a manner of speaking before we really evolved, and has been here as a tool to help us continue that evolution when we put our differences aside and we form a compassionate infrastructure towards ourselves and the earth. We build bridges that can help this human migration process take form again as climate changes, which it has in the past over thousands of years, and will indeed again happen in the future, so that our politicians and lawmakers can enact real change, so that people who are being imprisoned now for doing what humans have always done, which is migrate, can be treated with brotherly appreciation or sisterly appreciation, rather than being imprisoned and placed in deportation boxes and being put in inhumane situations due to their need to find safety and shelter in these tumultuous times in our world. So to keep the answer succinct, I think that mushrooms can help not only change our minds, but elevate our level of consciousness and help us to move in smarter and more grounded ways to make the world a better place in action, not just in word only. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was amazing. I'm seeing a common theme here in the responses. So I look forward to hearing what Bill is what you go by, sir?
Sure. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, Bill Barnard.
You got to put a word in for ayahuasca now, Bill.
Oh, I was going to say, come on. Exactly. That's the sacrament that I've been working with for since since 2005. And I've only really worked with it within the context of the Santo Daime tradition. And so when I'm speaking from within that tradition, but it's sort of an odd, the book I published, Liquid Light, is in one way a study of that tradition, but in other ways, I want to be really clear that I'm not like some sort of spokesperson for it. The Santo Daime is very clear that we have no proselytization. There's no sense that we are like the one and only path or the best way. It's like, and so even when we were asking the question, the best way forward, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I love the Santo Daime as a path. I don't know if it's the best way forward for everyone, but I can speak from my own experience there and talk about just more generally this notion of what it means to take a sacrament, plant medicine, as a sacrament in a regular, ongoing, committed, disciplined way as a part of a spiritual path, as the essential heart of a spiritual path. Right. And so that to me has been really crucial. And I think that there's a real gift there. And I don't know if it's clear enough for everyone, but for me, it's like, it's always been really important. I mean, this isn't the only spiritual path I've followed, and I've been studying religions and mystical paths, just even academically for decades now, and so, but at the same time, it's like, for the longest time, I was, just sort of spiritual, but not religious, which I think is a beautiful, actually, I mean, I'm all for this, but it's been, in fact, I used to remember when I first started drinking the daime, which is the name we give in this path to ayahuasca. I was hearing people talk about their religion, and I would just wince. Because it's like, I sort of wanted to get away from that sense of being sort of, religion carried some notions of sort of like being like, restrictive or what have you. But it's been really fascinating to me because, within the Santo Daime, to have a tradition that is a tradition that carries a weight, that has a lineage. This is a tradition that emerged from the inspiration of the man we call Mestre Irineo, African American, almost 7 foot tall, deeply beautiful, powerful healer, son of slaves. And he was inspired by his contact with indigenous and vegetalista versions of ayahuasca use in Brazil. But it was his own sort of inner revelatory experience that sort of said, that in essence sort of brought the Santo Daime as a specific religious path into this world. And so it's a path that has a tradition and a weight, right? And so within that, when you enter into a path like that, a lot of it has to do with a sense of, how does your ego meet a tradition that you are not in control of, right? And so it becomes a way in which you can, in the Santo Daime, it's very collective. Everything, it's like, and the rituals happen in a very, rigorous, disciplined, ongoing way in which there's a regular immersion into these high frequency states of energy and consciousness that I think are, because it's my deep, profound belief that, we're here on this planet to open ourselves up into that divine light that's the source of everything. And that's what, there's all sorts of things like, well, why would we do this? But to me, it's like, I was speaking to a couple of the elders in the Santo Daime tradition, and they were going, there are really, two main goals in the within the Santo Daime tradition, but I think it's more applicable to psychedelics in general. And the one is to awaken to our own divinity, to our own divine nature, to that sense of our experiential connection to that divine source that can appear in a multitude of ways, right? And then the other thing is how to incarnate more and more within our daily lives the energies of that connection, of energies to my mind, genuine, real presences and powers, healing, transformative powers of love, of wisdom, of joy, of freedom, of aliveness, of creativity, right? And how to become more and more transparent conduits of that healing energy that our planet so desperately needs, right? But for my mind, we start with ourselves, right? And I love being within a collective setting as well, because it's not just totally inner within the time. You have these sort of alternation where you could go deep within and have that profound experiential contact, not only with that divine source, but with all sorts of multitude of dimensions of reality and of different species of beings. I mean, literally like these non-physical beings that we can have beautiful, powerful, enlivening, transformative experiences with in a regular way. And to sort of and to be able to bring that inner immersion and those sort of beautiful visionary experiences out into the planet, literally like dancing, singing. We sing in the Daime. We sing together with our whole hearts, right? And sing these hymns that are linked from what we call the astral, that are received, that aren't like consciously created, but are like outpourings of hope and of beauty and of ways to sort of link in over and over again with that source we've been talking about, that sort of planetary universal field of consciousness, right? And so to my mind, that's the hope. That we really work in a sincere, ongoing way to transform ourselves, to be more and more increasingly transparent sort of conduits of that light and that energy. That to me that's what's real, right? And so I think we're interconnected, and we start with ourselves as the real center, and radiate that out and let it become just rippled out in sort of what we call the Indra's net of sort of each of us being a sort of like a pure radiant center of this interconnected network of these nodes that Paul was talking about, right? So anyway, that's my hope for psychedelics.
Great, thank you.
Beautiful. I look forward to connecting with you, Bill, and learning more, because I'm always intrigued when professors of religious studies are talking about this work today. So I thank you for the work you're doing. And that brings us to Ismail Ali from MAPS. Ismail, the proverbial floor is yours.
This is Fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Really grateful and excited for the conference coming up in just about a month. And there's a part of me that wants to just sit here in silence for 5 minutes while we absorb the incredible things that were just shared by the co-panelists. I really, really appreciate where this conversation has started. So props to you all, the moderators, for coming up with both the heaviest and most expansion and most solid kind of first question to start us off with, which is like, what the hell is the point here? What is going on here? And I just appreciate starting at that place, because it allows us to get detailed, as we start to get from a problem identifying into a problem solving kind of mode collectively. So I'll just share a few things. I think a lot of beautiful thoughts have been covered by Bill, by Acacea, and by Paul. And, I appreciate that Acacea mentioned Petro's speech, the current president of Colombia, because my personal kind of advent into drug policy had a lot to do with its global geopolitical impacts. And I feel like the shares here so far have touched on that scope, from those kind of global geopolitical factors, everything from the movement of the substances across, so-called borders, as well as the movement of people, and the scope of that to, of course, what you were just saying, Bill, which is like the level of individual transformation in community that becomes possible when we have a relationship with psychedelics broadly. And I love that scale. And I think that it's interesting that just in the spirit of having a good representation of mushrooms, a good representation of ayahuasca, bringing a little bit into kind of other plants, other relationships to these altered states, these other spiritual practices. I like to say that psychedelics are the sparkly rainbow gate into the shadow. And I think that part of what's coming out here is, and my answer to this question, I think, is that a big part of the role of psychedelics and plant medicines in this next phase has to do with that illumination of the shadow. Not just the illumination as in the dissipating of it, but also the illumination, like the seeing of it. And there are many examples, I think, in global geopolitics where we can see the human shadow being articulated, but drug policy is a really, really solid one. It's a really solid example because it touches on so many aspects of society. And a lot of my work with MAPS and broadly in the field has been really focused on the political, the policy, and the legal side of it, partially because those are some of the aspects that are so in control by other humans. And I agree with, my co-panelists in identifying some of these existential threats that I think our species is facing today. And maybe what I'll focus the next few minutes on is the threats that I see that are coming from ourselves, that are really kind of related to or downstream of human behavior and choices. And part of the reason I focus so much on policy and politics and law is because all those rules, those frameworks are fully constructed by humans. I think what I was hearing some of all of you share is that there's a set of rules or norms that are beyond our control as people. There are, some people call it the original instructions or kind of natural law, whatever that framing is. There's certain things that may just be true about the universe that are outside of our control, that we're learning about, that we're practicing in our spiritual paths and our mystical paths that we're participating in. But there are things that are in our control. And I think that, the current system as it operates, I think a lot of people act as if, and in many ways are subject to it, as if it's totally outside of their control or our control. And I think that there was like an indignant teenager in me at some point years ago that was like, wait a minute, there's got to be a way around these rules. And there's got to be another way to construct rules. And there's got to be another way to relate to them. So part of what I think is going on, and part of what I think the role of psychedelics and plant medicines have, is to show up in this battle of imagination that I think is emerging. I think that in order for us to believe that it's possible that we can live in another world. We have to be able to imagine it. And I think that a lot of systems, whether it's kind of to your point, Bill, certain like institutionalized religions or certain kind of racial dynamics or certain social economic dynamics have led to a paradigm in which people have a really limited imagination. The capacity for people to believe that things can be different is limited. I think about this a lot in the context of violence. I think that there are a lot of people who believe that violence and interhuman, interpersonal, intercommunity violence is an inherent part of the human condition. And I understand why people think that, but I wonder why the possibility that it isn't even on the table. And I think Acacea was sort of speaking to this, where the belief or naming the belief that a different world is possible kind of gets undermined by being labeled as a hippie or an outsider or on the margin. And it's kind of ironic that people are like that are trying to hold this bigger imagination are pushed out and are seen as less serious or less realistic than other people who are, in my mind, delusionally trying to live in a world that is not actually infinite, trying to have this world of infinite growth in a finite world. Like, to me, that's the delusion. The delusion isn't that we have to figure out a way to shift that dynamic. So I guess I say that to say that, to me, imagination feels like a big part of this. And like for us to collectively imagine that other aspects are possible. And that means like having a visionary conceptual imagination, but also very practical. Like, what are the steps that get us out of the carceral system, out of the punishment-based system, away from climate chaos, away from industrialization? Like, those are practical, technical questions that we can't just imagine our way out of, but we need to start there. So I think that a big part of psychedelics and plant medicines is to kind of like erode away some of that social conditioning that prevents people from having that level of imagination. And in the political world, in the world of the law, which is based, its function is the calcification of systems, and it kind of reinforces that over time. I feel like it's particularly important because of this aspect that like that is an area that we have control over, that we can choose to change policy. We can choose how we design our world and the impacts of that. There are a lot of things that are outside of our control. There are so many things that are outside of our control, but the way that we actually design the social environment, the political environment, even to some extent the cultural environment that we're in, is to some extent in our control. The question is then, how do we coordinate or collaborate? And this is sort of what you were saying, Paul. How do we get to that point where we're actually like working in the interest of each other, because it's better to be friends than foes? I think that that's really critical. A couple small things I'll say is related to my earlier point. I live in the United States. I live in California. And I thought a lot about how the United States in particular, the global North, but really the United States in particular, really exports a lot of its drug policy. And a lot of the kind of geopolitical impacts of drug control as it exists today originated in the United States or have been pushed, if not actively funded, by the United States. I'm Colombian myself. And so hearing Petro speak and hearing that acknowledgement in that sense, and hearing someone, a leader in Colombia, recognize the role of the United States and the role of the global North in its place, in the impacts in that geological kind of area really matters to me. My family left Colombia in the 80s because of the violence related to cocaine, in part, because of the violence related to the system as it operated. And I was just reading a report earlier this morning that I think cocaine production now is higher than it's ever been. And I think that there's a reason that that Colombia is starting to think about in a radically imaginative way what it looks like to legalize the production and sale and to look at what export looks like. There's a reason that in places like different parts of Canada, you have a conversation about what safe supply looks like, because if we don't solve some of these very technical questions, then the human cost of our own choices, whether it's the drug poisoning epidemic or the opioid crisis or any of these different things, like those are just as likely to catch up with us and undermine the survival of our species as any of the external ecological factors, I think, that are also kind of chasing us down as we continue to try to live infinitely in a finite world. The last thing I'll just briefly say has to do with the kind of a little bit more technical, maybe one of the other aspects of the role, and I'll speak about this a little bit more at the conference as well, which is around what plant medicines and psychedelics can offer to the larger conversation about drug policy and geopolitics. And this is a conversation that also came up at Psychedelic Science earlier this year, which is, if you're in many conversations around drug policy, the furthest that most places get is a personal decriminalization of a small amount of something, just enough so that people who are addicted or with substance use disorders are not criminalized for their, maybe health-based, maybe biology-based, depending on your theory, kind of issues that they're dealing with, disorders that they're dealing with. The interesting thing about psychedelics is that, and plant medicines right now, is that their place in the law and policy allows them to go further. In some ways, they actually are carving a path. We have to solve these questions for, if we're going to be taking all of these things out of the underground, what does that mean for them to interact with the current commercial or economic or political system? We have to solve that question for fentanyl. We have to solve that question for heroin and cocaine. But first, we can try to solve that question for mushrooms. We can first try to solve that question for the cactus. We can first try to solve that question for ayahuasca and for the other plants. And I think in that way, they are paving this way for us to think through some of the questions that are gnarly and really hard. And I think a lot of people on my side of the political spectrum don't want to think about. They don't want to think about the details of the market and capitalism. But we have to, because that is how the current world is operating, whether we like it or not. And there's a certain level of where, like, even though they're hard questions that people don't want to deal with, that these are testing grounds. We're sort of pressure testing ideas. And I think that's a little bit of one of the opportunities that we have right now. Really hoping that this allows us to collectively develop more responsibility. And I mean that, like, not just responsibility and accountability as a people, but ability to respond. Practical skills for ability to respond as the tensions and the stakes increase and the pressure of these geopolitical and ecological crises start to get closer. We need to build our capacity. So thanks.
Great. Yeah, well, that's great to bring that kind of perspective in, Ismail. Really appreciate that in this context. Yeah, a couple of times while you were speaking, I thought of something Terence McKenna said that seemed apropos. May the best idea win. So now we're going to open it up to the four of you. I don't know where Ismail or Acacea is. I haven't seen her image for a while.
Acacia's here. She just has her. There she is.
Oh, okay. Hi again. Okay, so for the next 20 minutes or so, we're just going to, Marc and I are going to step back and leave it to you folks. So, just speak up or raise your hand or something and, ask each other questions or add comments to anything that you've heard or that you wanted to say and didn't get to. All righty, go for it.
I'll begin. I just want to begin by saying what a joy it was to hear from such diverse perspectives. And I feel like I'm already really looking forward to the conference in the sense of being able to feel myself expanded and stretched. And I want to just give my thanks for the profound work each one of you are doing each of us in our own way. I've just been really struck already about the value of, diversity, the value of plurality, of these different sort of prismatic views on this question, and for each one of us to, offer our hearts and what we really care about and our expertise and our longing and what we feel we're here to do. And it's just really, I feel very inspired by this and appreciate that diversity. And more specifically, I wanted to, one thing that Ismail was saying that was sort of sparking me is saying, I love that notion of that these substances are this sparkly rainbow gate into the shadow. Come on, that's got to be like a bumper sticker or something, And I was really struck by that because, again, I can only speak for within the Santo Daime tradition. And so within our tradition, there's a whole notion of one of the works that the sort of the goals of the work we're doing is to illuminate that darkness in all sorts of different ways, and then to bring the transforming powers of divine light into each other, into the room, and hopefully radiating it out into the planet. To be able to sort of see within ourselves, within our own life situations, that which we need to sort of illuminate, to become aware of, to transform, and so that we can really be agents of that transformation and be able to more clearly see it and know how to respond, as Ismail was talking about, have that responsibility in a real guided, attuned, heartfelt way, right? That to me really feels important, and that's been a huge gift for me of these substances. So anyway, that's it.
Anyone? Go for it.
Well, I'd like to just comment where I see the underlying theme of connectivity of people and, you know, the planet. And Paul, I love what you said about, you know, giving back beyond more than, you know, when we have what we need to give back more, and it triggers that reciprocity effect. And I think that, you know, the world really needs to see less of me, and more of how can we help each other. And, you know, maybe someone could talk about ways in which we can do that, because we know that these medicines, that these plants, these psychedelics, these fungi have the ability to open up these parts of us. How can we then take that and move forward in our experience?
So I have a few words on that. Forgive me, I just ran into the house getting settled. But I was at a empowerment by Sharkin Rinpoche yesterday. And in the empowerment, he spoke about how the Jonang tradition is still not recognized by the Tibetan government. And if you don't know, the Jonang tradition is the only Tibetan tradition that has the full completion of Kalachakra teachings, as well as Shambhala teachings. And the Shambhala teachings are aspirations towards a golden era. Now, let me explain. Just like we form habits to wear masks during COVID, so such can everyone form habits that are mindful, you know, and I think that these traditions, whether it's Lakota tradition, Ghanaian tradition, Omoluwabe tradition, Sangoma tradition, or Tibetan tradition, they have different rites of passage that people take and go through, so that when they initiate into these higher states of consciousness, they go back into the real world, into their jobs, into their lives, and they enact real change grounded in that position. And I think that finding, I just want to say thank you, Ismail. By the way, like what you said really resonates with me on a really deep level, because my mother's father is from Cuba, and my father's mother is from Panama. And I am a child of both Latin American, Native American, and African individuals. And so when we talk about traditions, when we talk about Santo Daime tradition, in particular, Afro-Brazilian, Maestro Irano, is a really great example of someone who brought and integrated not only his own traditions, but indigenous and religious traditions together and merged them into practices with hymnals and songs that were helping people get further towards that goal of equanimity, that goal of being divine within oneself. The traditions that my teachers came from, Kalindi E in particular, the Tamarian tradition, as well as the Dogon and Ghanaian Ifa Orisha tradition, are very much the same. And there are aspects of Hinduism, there are aspects of Buddhism, there are aspects of all these other world traditions, but what they have in common, what these world traditions that are built on rituals, rites of passage, songs, mantras, prayers, all of these intentions are to prepare the human mind to enact real change. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of the plant medicine conversation is that people are so willing to pay money to go to a facilitator and be steeped in the energy of someone who is chanting and singing beautiful melodies. And that's perfectly fine. But to open it up to the greater public that you can live a life that is filled with those mantras and higher vibrational tonalities and songs that are birthed from your own heart, from your own ancestors, from your own mind, that there's an empowerment of people who work with psychedelics to connect with the present and to hold reverence in their hearts for the things that are in nature and inside of themselves, so that when they encounter challenges like drug reform issues, like political challenges, like climate change, that there is a gentleness and a kind approach with held inside of everything that is done in response. Because just like Ismail mentioned, it is kind of like a sparkly rainbow gate to the shadow side, but in so much that we celebrate in the psychedelic experience death and rebirth. We celebrate conquering the fear encumbered mind. And we celebrate through seeing very beautiful things. Sometimes we do tiny little rituals after we go through a mushroom trip, take a hot bath, we'll go eat our favorite food, because we're so grateful for the life that we have and so appreciative of the fear that came to teach us about ourselves. And so many people have had these experiences of transformation inside of the psychedelic experience, but don't have the confidence to treat it as anything more than just a trip. Don't have the confidence to take it and utilize that motivation to see themselves fully embodied in love and compassion inside one's mental state. And it's how you react outside of the psychedelic experience that defines your life. Not so much the pretty colors and the interactions with animals, but the real life reverence you have for animal life. What you do in your community matters. What you do in your family life matters just as much as what you do in your psychedelic life. And what the difference is that many of these ancient cultures have formula to integrate one's reality life, one's home life, one's psychological life, and into the psychedelic experience, so such that when you have these transcendental experiences, you come back into a supportive framework. And I think that's what so many of us are missing in the United States today, is that supportive framework that has been taken over in the last 250 years in this country by capitalism and many social issues and the need to survive rather than the opportunity to live and find presence. So many people in the United States are living in a survivalist reality, one moment to the next, one paycheck to the next. And when you integrate psychedelics into that kind of a world, we have people who have serious levels of depression saying, wow, for the first time I realized I don't have to do this to myself anymore. And the United States is going to need to face what happens with the destabilization of the workers' economy, where people decide to do what they love instead of what they had to do to survive previously. People who do spiritual work and services now have their own economy, whereas in previous times and ages, those people who are just now fighting to have an economy, the seers, the oracles, the tarot card readers, were considered sages to early and first peoples, to my people, to the people of Ghana, to the people of Nigeria. The Babalawus are sacred. To the Lakota people in my bloodline, the Heyokas are sacred. And now that we have these groups waking up and realizing that the abilities or the psychological disturbances that they've faced in their lives are actually due in part to their lineage or ancestry, and have a cultural heritage and meaning that has been suppressed and at many times assimilated out of. It's a grave understatement to say that our country needs a wake-up call
our country needs psychedelics because we are in a geopolitical climate that requires us to look at the dark and form a really good idea to take apart and to do what the mushrooms do best, which is to decompose that darkness and transmute it into light, which is the true alchemy, I think, that the ancients revered so much, hidden in the psychedelic states.
Oh, good stuff. That's a lot of teachings. Hey, Paul, I thought maybe I'd ask you a question because, of course, Bill speaks about a highly structured ritual environment. Acacea alluded to different kinds of rituals and ceremonial practice. If I'm not mistaken, Paul, you have been more on your own with your use of psilocybin. And I'm just wondering if I could be wrong about that, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about ritual, ceremonial use and that sort of thing in regard to psilocybin mushrooms.
Well, thank you for asking. I've been always anti-structure. So I always feel that structures were confining. And I grew up in a religious environment, a charismatic Christian environment, and I rebelled against that. I'm very much feel like that psilocybin brings me in contact directly with nature. So nature is my cathedral. Nature is my church. I feel the rocks, the plants, the ocean, the stars, everything speaks to me. I don't want to have an envelope separating me from the divine, nor do I want to have orchestrated rituals, which may have been proven to be very successful in long traditions. I respect that. That's fine. Everyone should have freedom of choice. Everyone should have freedom of consciousness. I think psychedelics and the use of it is a basic civil right. All that being said, we have personal needs and comfort levels. Some people want to be in a group of individuals with a structured environment because it gives us safety. There's people have done this before. It's a path that's been well traveled. They understand the guardrails, etc. That's fine. That's not something that I do. I like to be with a loved one or a small group of people. I like to just throw my heart and soul into the universe and feel that connection, to everything. So I'm sort of anti-structure for my own personal. I'm always concerned that absolute power corrupts absolutely. As soon as you put somebody on a pedestal and they become the gateway to the heavens, then they're elevated to this position of being a higher authority. And therein, it's almost anti-democratic, just to the very nature. So what I'm saying is that for my experiences, some people, it's in this movement, since I've been in it for a long time, as many of you have, it's surprising what people don't know. As an example, there was these voices that we should pay the Mazza tax or royalty for psilocybin mushrooms. Okay, so let's sort of track that down. There are cultures all over the world that were using psilocybin mushrooms. Maria Sabina had her ritual, and if you haven't seen her ceremonies, there's a movie coming out. I've seen 3 different films on her ceremonies. She smokes cigarettes, she claps her hands, and she pays tribute to the Holy Trinity. I don't do any of those things. I don't clap my hands, I don't smoke cigarettes, and I don't pray to Jesus and the Holy Trinity. That's not saying that Maria Sabina is doing anything wrong, but it's really interesting to me that, people should be very tolerant of individual choices. And this is what psychedelics are liberating. They liberate you from the shackles of conventional thinking, of people trying to hold you back, people saying that you have an obligation to some other practice, when your own personal journey is indeed that, your personal journey. So I applaud all these other, disciplines and methodologies that have been developed they've served some very important societal survival reasons. Maria Sabina was a devout Catholic, but I would imagine, and then Mexico is very Catholic, as you know, and I would imagine that part of that's a fusion of being able to continue your indigenous practices at the same time when an overriding, more powerful religion comes in to take over a society. So some of these are definitely survival mechanisms, maybe initially, but then there's a fusion of cultures that occurs. So from my perspective, everyone should have the freedom of choice. I've always said for decades now, wealth is not materialism. Wealth is having the freedom of choice, optionality. No, everyone should be given the optionality to express themselves in the way that they best is for them, that they see.
Yeah.
I'm worried about if different sacraments are preserved and protected through traditional structures that have been erected, over time, then it's me versus them. And that's something that I think we have to make sure that those walls are not put up to preserve these other structures that have religious practices that are very different than my own personal experience of being in contact directly with the universe.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm informed. I think it's wonderful, but Orthodox religions scare the shit out of me.
Hey, Paul, I'm gonna step in here because I'm pretty damn sure that both Bill and Acacea would have a lot to say about that. But to move things along, I think we should keep going because that could be a very long topic. But thank you for that, alternate perspective there. So, Marc, if I may, I'd like to ask Ismail a question to finish up this round. Ismail, I don't know, did you, just as a starting point, did you happen to notice an article by Jamie Wheel recently with the title Psychedelic Fascism?
I actually have not read that. No, I can assume what it's about, but go ahead and.
Well, I don't remember all the details, but it was basically the sort of the corporate capitalist greedy takeover of the psychedelic renaissance. I just wondered if you have any further thoughts on that.
Well, I have thoughts on the idea for sure. I can just jump in even if I haven't looked at the article. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and I think it kind of ranges from the philosophical and theoretical to like the technical and practical, and the latter being questions of, and I think even Paul and I have had conversations about this, about IP and ownership, some of the points that you were just touching on, but also theoretical around like what does it mean to be including esoteric practices into a commercial structure, which Acacea, you were kind of also touching on too, which is like we're in a new paradigm where like some of these esoteric practices have an economy now in a way that they didn't before, in a way that they were kind of incorporated within community structures. And now we have kind of a different paradigm of self-promotion and personal branding, which is a new paradigm, especially for some of those esoteric practices. So there's a lot of kind of changes happening at the same time with respect to how those operate. And, I mean, what I'll say is it's interesting, obviously, having, working at MAPS, an organization that is in many ways has been at the intersection of some of those questions as we get, closer to potential FDA approval and participation in kind of the pharmaceutical kind of medical health paradigm, mental health paradigm on one hand, and then my policy work at the 501c3, which is much more focused on legal adult use, regulated use, and then decriminalization, just total elimination of criminal penalties for community and kind of, you could say, I don't want to say non-economic or non-commercial use, because many substances, even in the underground right now, are being sold for profit, whether or not we like it. Like there is a certain level of that kind of baseline. So, touching a little bit back on some of the points that Acacea was making earlier and that I was making earlier, like, as the conversation about shifting global drug policy is not just a conversation about policy and ideology, it's also one about economics. And if we are going to move toward an environment where we kind of legalize or decriminalize not just the psychedelic plant medicines, but other plant medicines, including coca and its derivatives and opium and its derivatives and all of the things that people are usually scared of and call hard drugs, which are also plant-based. We have to have a conversation about the commercialization of it. Like, we can have a conversation about safe supply of, drugs that are more dangerous for people who are less educated or less experienced with them. But someone's got to make them. If we're going to be talking about quality control for a product, then someone's going to make it, which means that someone's going to manufacture it and someone's going to cultivate it and someone's going to sell it to someone, So I say that to say that there's a lot of very interesting questions that come up when thinking about the economics of this, which are very fascinating and somewhat intimidating. And I think what I'll say is one of the things that I've been concerned about, participating in the drug policy conversation for some time now, is because of the resistance to having the conversation about the economics. There has been some ceding of territory in the conversation. So one of the reasons I think multi-state operators, MSOs, and like Philip Morris and other large kind of tobacco or alcohol companies have such a seat at the table in the federal government's policymaking around cannabis is because of the dynamics that led to the fracturing of the movement related to cannabis early on. And I'm hoping that we can avoid that in this conversation around psychedelics and plant medicine, which is to say, in order for there to be a continued voice and an opinion for people who varying opinions about how we do this next phase of the commercialization, the marketing, and all of that good stuff, then there needs to be a willingness to look at those issues head on and be like, okay, who are the players, what are the factors involved, and what the next step will look like. I used to be, like many of my colleagues around the field and in the movement, I used to be really freaked out by this. And I think there was a long phase where I was really, really worried about, this kind of corporate takeover thing. And there's certain aspects that I'm still super concerned about, especially when it comes to Western medical healthcare in particular, especially in the United States, where we're not dealing with an environment that has universal healthcare, where even if you do get it into the healthcare system, that still doesn't mean it's accessible to people. So there's a lot of practicalities there regarding insurance and so on that I think very much need to be, navigated carefully and precisely with orientation and focus on detail. And there's a couple practical things that have made me a lot less concerned in the last year. In the last couple of years, maybe. And one of them is that I actually sincerely believe that, for lack of a better kind of metaphor, the pirates will always be ahead of the industry, which is to say, there will always be an underground. I don't think that the pharmaceutical industry or capitalism as a concept is, and I mean that in the sense of industrial Western capitalism, because of course capitalism exists in the sale of drugs everywhere around the world right now to a certain extent. But I say that to say that I don't think that any government actually has the power to stop that. I don't think any industry has the power to stop that. It would have happened already. And I think that even though there may be a new layer of this kind of commercial industrial aspect to some of these things, which do have certain concerns, especially I think spiritual and in some ways very important esoteric concerns for the power of the medicine and where it comes from and the cultural backing and so on. I actually think that as long as people can grow at home, as long as territories are protected, which are not assumed, right? Those are things that can change, although those are political decisions too. Then I think that people will always be able to get access to what they need. It just may take time in different channels, but there's a reason. I think, the metaphor I used to give a lot is with respect to torrenting music or illegally downloading music. Some people might remember in the pre-Spotify, pre-SoundCloud era, there were all these websites where you can download music for free, right, illegally. And every single time, when Napster got busted, 3 new ones popped up. And when those got busted, the torrents popped up. So there was kind of this way where even if there is, and there will be a lot of interest from highly capitalized interests, and there already is, that will never be the whole story. So that's one thing. And then a more practical aspect is unlike something like cannabis, which is a little bit more straightforwardly a product kind of economy. I'm not saying it should be. I'm just saying that's how it's kind of how it's been designed. A storefront, you buy a plant and then you go home and do whatever. The practical difference in kind of the conversation around psychedelics in the more Western therapeutic context with facilitation is one in which a lot of the cost is not in the substance itself, but it's in the hours of time and the labor of care. And I think that that's quite significant, because what that means is that unlike, other commodities, which are cultivated or manufactured and then processed and then put in front of a consumer and the consumer buys it, the way that seems to be part of what seems to be emerging now is that there is this secondary, adjacent economy. And this goes a little bit to what you were saying too earlier, Acacea, kind of this economy of people who are there to hold space and to support. And that isn't something you can just scale. You can't just AIify. You can't just mass produce hours of care in the way that you can mass produce a molecule. So there's some fundamental differences there. And
Ismail,
yeah.
If we could wrap up in the sake of time, we've got about 14 minutes left. I want to make sure that we really honor and acknowledge everybody's time for coming out this afternoon. So I'd like to be able to step into wrapping up, because I feel like we could just go on and have these conversations for hours. There's been so many things that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But we've got 14 minutes left. I want to make sure that we're on time, because it's just being mindful and respectful of people's time. And I really appreciate everybody being here. But maybe we can just kind of go around the circle. We'll start with Bill. We'll go to Paul. We'll go to Acacea, and we'll come back to you, Ismail. And maybe you can just summarize your thoughts. Let us know what you're going to be speaking about at the conference, what people can look forward to, and we'll go from there. So, Bill.
Yeah, thank you so much. For myself, it's really what I'm going to be speaking about in the conference is an extension upon what I just touched upon a little today, which is that what I want to begin to have a conversation about what is it like to have that opening up in an ongoing, regular, very uplifted way, to have these interactions with non-physical beings and to begin to understand the multidimensional nature of reality and the interplay between self and other that's there, and that sense of discovering who we are in these really, it's like this sense of this interplay between, because within the Santo Daime tradition, there's a lot of what we call mediumship, of just incarnating different energies and spiritual presences. And so it becomes a whole school of, who are we really under the surface, and how deep do we go, and how interconnected are we? And are these beings that we can learn to establish relationships with? In some ways I feel that they're like overtones of our own deepest self, and in other ways they're extremely inherently beautifully different, right? And so there's this interplay between sameness and difference that I feel is really cool when we think about who are we, right? And to what extent, how we can find our sense of, our deepest rooting in some divine presence, but that sense of also just diverse, ever-changing, dynamic interconnection with others, right? And how we are formed and shaped by that, and how we radiate out and can influence the world around us. So to my mind, it's a study on how to become ultimately like a Buddha in the center of a sacred mandala, right? Where we are really rooted as much as we can in a genuine way in our hearts, and in this place of connection to that divine source, and genuinely fully human beings who are just aware of and engage with the struggle with people's live day-to-day suffering, and willing to lend a hand and to serve, right? And so that's a lot of what I'm hoping to talk about in the conference, and sort of just like what I think Ismail was talking about, like our power to imagine ourselves really as radiant beings, and to experience ourselves and to develop that imagination into reality, to realize it, right? Anyway, So that's
Beautiful, Bill. Yeah. So,
Thank
Paul,
you.
can you give us a real quick hint of what you might talk about at the conference?
Yeah, I really want to give a shout out to the heroic leadership of the women scientists and mycologists. Many people may not realize Maria Sabina was not just a healer, but she was a mycologist. She went out into the mountains and she knew the differences between psilocybin-containing mushrooms and poisonous mushrooms. She could collect them. And also, Tina Wasson, who is R. Gordon Wasson's wife, unfortunately, she died in 1958, I think. She was also a mycologist. She knew mushrooms by their Latin binomials. From them coming together, a lot of us have this knowledge, or build upon the knowledge that they've conveyed, which is super important. So what I'm going to talk about also is the very plausible and strong evidence that the Egyptians also used psilocybin, specifically Psilocybe cubensis. I recently went to 10 temples in Egypt and found mushroom hieroglyphics all over every temple in the shape of Psilocybe cubensis. I'm not the first person. Another mycologist by the name of Abzim Abdul also published on this in 2016. While I was there, I was introduced to a very interesting group of people who are bringing now the blue lotus, which grows in ponds, a water lily, before desertification, all along the Nile. It was much more vegetation. The water lily is being collected, the blue lotus at ponds. Psilocybe cubensis grows on cow manure. Cows go to ponds in order to drink. So, and the golden and blue color in Egyptian culture is sacred. And common people were banned from collecting mushrooms. Now, Cleopatra was a lover of Caesar and Mark Antony, and where the Eleusinian mysteries were occurring. So, of course, you'd be sharing the secrets. And Cleopatra actually funded the Roman army. So this sort of cross-cultural exchange of information is deep. Happened in Germany, Ireland, very likely in Africa, certainly in Egypt, Northern Africa. Also the Titili cave art in Algeria. These are all very proximate to each other. And there's a massive amount of trade that was going on. It's from monotheism and suppression of these indigenous use and First Peoples use of sacraments that I think was the first war on drugs. I think we need a peace treaty with psychedelics. We need a peace treaty with psilocybin. And what I'm concerned about is that there are walls being built up between cultures when it's actually cross-cultural exchange that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. So I'm excited to show you these hieroglyphs that we found. We are writing an article that will probably be submitted to a journal of ethnobotany with 2 other scientists. We're doing DNA sequencing now around the temples to see if there's Psilocybe cubensis spores. We put out a reward for wild Psilocybe cubensis. And something that I've been very passionate about, I know Maria Sabina's family circle, Inti and Guaramo, and I've been very actively in communication with them and supporting and preserving the Maria Sabina Library. So this is something that is interesting to me as well, because Juliana Furshi, visiting the Mazatecs, because of the interest in psilocybin mushrooms and because of climate change and lack of resources, they're using Psilocybe cubensis now, which is cultivated. Psilocybe cubensis, which came over likely with the Spaniards. So, and now Psilocybe azotiocorum cerulescens and Psilocybe mexicana, which Maria Sabina used, Psilocybe azotiocorum grows in Quebec. So it's interesting, as we delve into this more deeply, we realize how extensive the use of psilocybin mushrooms are ecologically and culturally. And the lesson from psilocybin is to exchange information, to support each other, to try to build bridges and not fences and divides, and to be informed by all traditions. And no one tradition owns it. No one tradition should be blamed. we're all struggling, I think, on the same path to be able to achieve a higher state of being and be better citizens and just kinder, nicer people.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, thank you. Hey, now, Acacea, I can see by your facial expressions that you have a lot to say about a lot of what's been said here. But so I'm sorry, to have to squeeze you down. But in honor of Marc's deadline here, could you just give us a very brief hints of a couple of things you're going to talk about at the conference?
I will be speaking about the legacy of Kalindi Iyi, who was a mycologist who traveled to Egypt, like Paul Stamets, and lectured for many decades about Egyptian mushroom use, though he was not published in articles and such. As someone who has practiced the Tamarian lineage traditions, which detail the use of Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms for actualization of Neteru, or ancestral deities for exploration, I will continue to teach about his legacy in that regard, as well as to highlight the technology and the ritual implements that were utilized in crystal technologies for traversing multidimensional realms consciously, embedded with maps from one's elders and ancestral lineages to keep track of locations where individuals can come together and have an experience without being in the same house from thousands of miles away, utilizing psilocybin cubensis as a communication technology, as well as a divinatory tool. And then I'm going to talk about how mushrooms can help us evolve, specifically about healing religious trauma and the actual roots of some of the non-dual religious ideas of Aztec philosophy, which do not involve a hierarchical figure of man versus God, but i.e. God as man and brothers as God and divine beings incarnate, no separation from nature, being also a non-dual and an impartial force, teot or ome teot, that was represented in Aztec philosophy. So I will be talking a great deal of the bones of these traditions that are, at least those who represent them well are not trying to build walls between anyone's practices and their own, but simply tear down the ones that we make up for ourselves in our head, which is the illusion of separation of man and God altogether. So I will be educating at the conference. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Ismail, I think we know the general direction of where you're going, but could you just give us a couple of hints?
I'm just going to solve all of our problems for us. I'll just give us all the solutions. I'll just drop an hour of solid, just problem solving. No, I've been thinking a lot about harmonization, not the musical kind. I'm not particularly skilled of a singer myself, but of just harmonization between different approaches. I think that as we have in the last few years of kind of fractaling within the field and the movement, which I think in many ways has been good. Like I like to say that we're now disagreeing with each other for openly and visibly for the first time in a way. I think that's very generative, which is starting to put some cracks into the assumptions about the field and the movement. More and more people are showing up with their particular perspective and their particular worldview, whether that's ideological or political or otherwise. And I think I'll be talking a bit about how to reconcile some of the perceived tensions between different policy approaches with the hopes of planting a seed for a more affirmative, generative, and interconnected post-prohibition paradigm. I think that if you look back, and I'll say this at the beginning of my talk, if you look back, a lot of people look back and they're like, whoa, the war on drugs really didn't work, or it did work under this particular racist, socially oppressive structure. Okay, that's bad. But then people look forward and no one can really agree on where to go. So even if we have consensus that where we've been is not so good, where we go is harder to figure out. So then we're going to talk a little bit about harmonizing different approaches in that sense. Yeah.
Beautiful. Marc, do you want to do a wrap up?
Absolutely. Well, first, I just want to thank our guests in our panel, Bill, Acacea, Paul, Ismail. Thank you very much for taking your time out of your day to, answer the question and really enlighten us in your view on how psychedelics can really help upshift the planet and, you know, create change for humanity. It's really an important subject. And I look forward to Paul seeing and meeting you again at the conference this year, and meeting Acacea, Ismail, and Bill for the first time. And if there's any way we can always, you know, support your work in this world of psychedelics, then we are happy to definitely share that with you so that we can share more. It's really about getting this work out there so we can make a difference in the world. And I personally, in my own experience, know that these plants, these fungi, these medicines can make a difference, can wake us up, can open up other dimensions and parts of our lives. And I look forward to what you have to share. And I look forward to gathering together in community for what our conference has always been very well known for, is that sense of community. And again, I thank you so much for your time today and sharing your wisdom with the community and the people around the world who've tuned in. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark and Stephen, and
Thank
co-panelists,
you.
Paul and Bill and Acacia. Looking forward to seeing you all in a month.
Thanks so much, folks. Thanks a lot for taking this time.
Awesome.
Great. Until next time, Chief Ruben George joins us on Friday. His time has changed. It's now going to be 4:00 in the afternoon. We're going to talk about It Stops Here, his new book. He'll be speaking at the conference as well. So we look forward to seeing him and speaking with him. He's just such a beautiful soul and has got some great things to say and share for us all to consider. And of course, I'd also like to thank our sponsors for making all of this happen. Conscious Living Network, of course, the founder of Spirit Plant Medicine, Dragonfly Earth Medicine, Sabia, Cosmic Sister, Ad Lucum Law, Simon Hayduke, Hubcast, where we are here at the studios doing this upscale production of what I used to call Marc's Amateur Zoom Hour, and with TheraSil, Filament Health, and many of the great people who support the work that we do so we can bring these messages to the world. So thank you very much.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
That was great.